Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Marc Maron did an appearance on the Pod Save America podcast. It was just with the John Lovett guy this time. They don't really seem to be doing like, you know, guys in a room type of podcast anymore. I feel like most of the time I see this, they're like on a Zoom call or something. So I don't really know what the deal is with that. But, you know, they're still pretty much in the same position, pretty staunch liberal, establishment liberal type perspective, but they're trying to figure it out. They're trying to figure out what the Democrats did wrong. They're trying to be a little bit more open to some of the more left-wing rhetoric that they might have been allergic to in the past, but I think they're still allergic to it, frankly, and they're allergic to the type of analysis that is going to lead to different conclusions. And you see that a little bit in this interview. Really, anytime I hear these guys talk, I hear the same thing. So I'll show you a little bit of that. But really, Marc Maron is just talking more about Joe Rogan, the Rogan Sphere, his recent special where he talks about comedy culture, Trump. He even mentions Theo Von specifically in the special, has a bit about Theo Von doing a casual interview with Adolf Hitler. So pretty good. I mean, I think that bit is going to stand the test of time, honestly. And so, you know, Mark's been doing a lot of name dropping, and I think it's good. I think he's decided that the negative impact of the people in Austin and the Rogan types is enough that it justifies pretty shameless bashing and invoking of names. So I'm all for it. And there's some interesting points made in this interview, but the main thing that I thought was interesting is that Mark brings up Elephant Graveyard, who I talked about recently, video essayist who makes creative essays criticizing comedy and the sort of right-leaning and just hack-leaning aspect of comedy. And he dropped a great video recently about Joe Rogan and Tony Hinchcliffe and the sort of like cult-like nature of the Austin comedy scene. And Marc Maron brings that video up specifically here. So that video has made a big impact. And Elephant Graveyard puts a lot of effort into these videos, and I mentioned in the video that I made about it that it may be the beginnings of the most effective response to what we're getting from Austin and people like Joe Rogan and the right-leaning side of comedy. So let's listen to what Marc Maron had to say about it real quick. Just an interesting little moment, and then we'll move on to some other topics.
I just watched a brilliant documentary this morning. I've watched all this guy's stuff. It's a guy, he calls himself Elephant Graveyard on YouTube. And it specifically focuses on the alignment of politics and comedy. He did one called The Comedy Czar about the Rogan sphere and the manosphere, and he did one just today about, it was called, I'll tell you because I think they're important to watch because it's sort of the world that, you know, I live in. It's called Comedy Jonestown, How Comedy Was Destroyed by an Anti-Reality Doomsday Cult. And I think that is a bigger conversation about what you're saying, that, you know, the propaganda and the existence of social media platforms and what they can do to the human brain and what they can do to foment a sort of mania.
Yeah, mania is a good word for it.
The guy in this new documentary, in the Doomsday Cult documentary, identifies something about collaborators that may not have seen themselves as being willing collaborators at the beginning, but they go through something called, I think he called it philosocide, which is where you don't kill yourself, but you kill yourself inside. And if you look at somebody like Marco Rubio or anybody within that administration, in what happens in cult-like behavior is some point after another, in order to stay in the game, they kill whatever principles they might have had, even though they were a few.
One way I think people rationalize it is around, well, you know, I don't like Trump, but I really hate the fucking Democrats, right? Or like, I'm totally on board with this, but both sides.
Yeah, but that's a false equivalency.
Of
right?
course it is. Of course it is. But what I see, there is a reason that Donald Trump gains purchase in this ecosystem of podcasts at the same time that a bunch of this anti-woke, anti-trans masculinity core takes hold at the same time. And it has to do with there's some way in which a lot of men feel lost. And,
sure.
And there's order and meaning in what Trump offers,
sure.
in what kind of the Rogan kind of way of learning about the world.
Daddies are pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And, you know, these docs that he talks a lot about the daddy hole in these guys, you know, from bad daddies, that void that needs to be filled. And, you know, a lot of megalomaniacal people come from that. Trump comes from that.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I'm no psychiatrist or psychologist, you know, but in order for someone to define themselves, especially if they're lost or they feel neutered or diminished, if you get the right words into those people, they're going to light up. And if they feel like they have a leader, they're going to light up.
Yeah, so just a quick clip there, but I think they're starting to touch on something really interesting, which is Marc Maron mentions the daddy-shaped hole, which is something from the Elephant Graveyard video. And they both talk a lot about this idea of leadership and how if a leader is able to say the things that inspire parts of you that get you excited. And that is what Trump has done well in his base, is he has said the right things that get them excited. In some cases on the basis of hatred and racism, in some cases not. In some cases based on other types of myth making and that sort of thing. But that is what Donald Trump has been able to cut through and reach people with, whereas Democrats have been more cautious with their messaging. And the aspects of the left, you know, further left than Democrats, people who've been making a lot of noise, anywhere from Bernie Sanders to the sort of activist base that was dogging Kamala Harris during the election, and rightfully so, that messaging is seeming to emerge as more popular with people because it's exciting. And in the case of Zohran Mamdani, it's a clear indication of someone who's willing to break from a corrupt political system. And people are starting to get an idea of how that corrupt political system is directly tied and directly fuels what's happening in Gaza with the genocide and all these other kinds of atrocities. And so in that, you have a rare example of some pretty direct political pressure, palpable political pressure being applied to a popular candidate, and his rejection of that has only made him more popular. And so, you know, the only politicians who are going to do well on the Democratic side or anywhere in that realm is ones who really cut through with a strong message. And there may be some exceptions to that rule. There are districts throughout the country where more moderate Democrats are still going to be who wins because some of the people voting for those Democrats are not typical Democratic voters. That's the reality. That's the reality that brought us people like Joe Manchin and stuff like that. So, you know, the issue of centrist Democrats probably isn't going to go away, but the only hope is that the progressive wing of the party that's willing to be more bold can take up enough space that it forces those types of Democrats to go along with it. And that's where the pod save type voices out there are important, because they are starting to get on that message. And it's very, very tepid, and it's very, very, you know, begrudging. But they're starting to embrace a guy like Zohran Mamdani because he is the lightning rod that is needed in response to Trump. So what the style of video that Elephant Graveyard achieves is it delivers images to you in a way that's entertaining and it's funny, but it fully fleshes out a worldview and a mythology that places Rogan and the powers that be behind him and the sycophants underneath him and the audience surrounding him. It puts them all into context in a way that is, you know, wildly exaggerative and fun and mythological and sort of like crazy sci-fi fantasy type feeling. And that, in a way, is what Joe Rogan has done with his audience, is he's successfully mythologized the world in a way that makes it make sense to lean towards a guy like Trump. So instead of viewing things from a political spectrum point of view, where it's pretty easy to reject Donald Trump because he's too far right, instead of that, they've created a worldview where the biggest enemy is like the system, right? And the system is shady enough that you can accuse any entity of being the system, and you can ignore the systemic qualities of any entity that you choose to ignore. And so that is how Joe Rogan has found himself, affiliated with the Peter Thiels, the Mark Andreessens, the Elon Musks, and the Donald Trumps, is that he has chosen to believe that the system that he has spent his career mythologizing is something different from those guys. And those guys are actually the renegades who are trying to destroy the system. And that framework has been extremely effective with his audience. There's many people out there who think like that. And I think that the Peter Thiels and some of the creepiness of the things that he said, as well as the fact that he's just a creepy guy, I think has started to crack through to people, especially this Epstein stuff and the fact that Joe Rogan is having CIA people on to talk about Epstein, and they're being really dodgy and weird. He has conditioned his audience to be highly skeptical and highly scrutinize people like that, anybody who has any connection to the CIA, and then now because Kash Patel is the head of the FBI, he is not the system, so having him on is okay. It's okay to just let him paint his narrative uncritically, because what the system is that I'm against is something deep and dark and shady, and it's different from this guy. And so that's how Joe Rogan has become, probably the most easily manipulated influencer on the planet, as well as one of the most influential. And so this mythology that Elephant Graveyard has created is useful because the mythology and the worldview that the Democratic Party and even progressives and people further left than that have been rolling with and developing this whole time has not connected as well with people as the worldview that anyone from Joe Rogan to Donald Trump to Tucker Carlson has created. And so whether or not, Elephant Graveyard is a perfect example, who knows? I don't know if he's on the left. I don't know what his positions are on various issues. A lot of these comedy critique guys are not that political. Elephant Graveyard is one of the only ones who's been explicitly political, which is honestly why I think his content hits better, because people are looking for that. But, the worldview of the left has been effectively characterized by the right to many masses of people who don't consider themselves right. So that is the ground that we need to take back. And it seems like the most effective way of doing that is not the fact checks, it's not the debates, it's not the experts, but it is creatively using these guys' own aesthetics and their own worldviews against them in an exaggerated way. And it's kind of an evolution of what, the Majority Report and people like that have been doing for a long time. It's one of the reasons that I really respect the Majority Report, and I've learned a lot from the way that they use mockery and they use mimicry as a way to not just chip away at the seriousness of these people, anyone from Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro or whoever, but also to get close to them in terms of the algorithm, right? But by talking about certain people and by kind of creating narratives around certain people, you start to reach the audiences that are interested in those people. And that is exactly what the Comedy Critique podcasts have done. That's exactly what Elephant Graveyard has done. It's what I'm trying to do, is reach as many of those people as we can and reframe the worldview a little bit so that we can start to open up the door again towards a more progressive, less fascistic direction for the country. And I'm not even talking about electoralism here. I'm just talking about the way people feel. Because whatever your view of the solution to our current situation in America is, we got to convince as many people as possible that the worldview that those in power are running with right now is crooked and flawed, and we've got to present a really strong counter worldview to that. So Elephant Graveyard's style of critique, I think, is a great starting point for the way to break down the narratives that a lot of these audiences have swallowed uncritically. And our job as people who are more politically involved than that is to craft a worldview that's more developed, that's going to be appealing to the most amount of people possible, and can ultimately take hold as the predominant narrative in American politics. So probably the other most important thing to mention right now is Trump ramping up his plans to militarize different democratic cities in America. So some of the troops in Washington, D.C. have started carrying weapons. And Trump, along with threatening Chicago, saying that Chicago is the next place that he is going to try to deploy the National Guard to, he's also making additional threats to cities like Baltimore, which was not on his supposed list before. But I guess because the governor said something or crossed him or something like that, he was wanting to leverage sending the National Guard into the city as a method of political punishment. So that's how Trump operates. It is likely that this second Trump presidency is going to result in that type of politics becoming the norm. The only way that would not happen is if the backlash to Trump, electorally and just in the future of American politics is so enormous that it delegitimizes most of his actions as president. So that's possible, but it doesn't seem like things are going in that direction right now. And that is overall my fear with Trump and how these deployments are going in these cities so far, is that this is not obviously something that people in the cities want. Cities by and large go blue. All of these cities that he is sending troops to are blue for a reason. And this is something that people who don't live in cities voted for. Not to say that there aren't people in the cities who did vote for Trump. We know that that is the case, especially in this last election. However, for the most part, if we're talking about majorities, the people who wanted this are the people who live in the middle of the country, who have an idea of what it is like in the city, a concept of it, but they don't live there. And so what I worry about is that the perception of these deployments is going to be positive, because if Trump is able to, create the impression that by sending tanks and soldiers onto the streets, that it makes people safer, it cleans up crime. People do very much have the perception that homelessness, crime, drugs, and stuff like that is so out of control that it warrants stuff like this. Already, I've talked to people who don't feel that sending the military into these cities is an overreach or an overreaction in any way. So it all depends on what the images of this that people are going to see going forward are. And what Trump and his media apparatus is good at doing is presenting images to people that invoke a certain feeling. And the feelings that he has invoked in his audience, his base, is the feeling of wanting authoritarian responses to perceived problems. So by showing them images of, supposedly safer communities, or people saying, oh, I love having these soldiers that are, guarding my house with their guns, there's going to be people out there who buy that and repeat it and really internalize it. But if we are aggressive about finding opportunities to show to people the reality of deploying military to these cities in these ways, the encroachment on people's freedom, the cruelty of it, there's many people out there that don't care about that at all. But there's a lot of people that do, that are emotionally open to those type of images. And if there's anything that people in America are overall skeptical of, it's, government overreach, government authoritarianism, rolling the tanks into the cities. Obviously, the Republicans don't care about that if it's not their hometown. They want to send the military to blue cities because they view blue cities as the enemy. But there's a lot of people out there that understand the concept that it's inherently bad for the president to be sending the military into different cities. And also, he has less authority to do that in other cities than Washington, D.C. There's a reason he's starting there. And so back to what I was saying before about, illustrating a narrative and a worldview for people that people can get on board with. I think it's important to continue to remind people and invoke the images of this authoritarian military overreach, because it's naturally something that invokes a response. And just as there's a bunch of people out there who fetishize that and want it, there's a bunch of people out there who are going to be shocked and scared and inspired into action because of that. And just because things, seem hopeless in certain moments, the only way that they won't continue to seem hopeless is if we use every moment that we can to do something, to put the right images in front of people, put the right information in front of people, say the right thing, go out into the streets. We want to be careful about confrontation with these soldiers, depending on the way the tides turn, because Trump could easily invoke the Insurrection Act if there are violent incidents occurring. But the best way to resist what's happening in these cities is to utilize the networks that already exist in these communities to get information out, keep people safe, and keep people informed about what's happening. And the further this authoritarian takeover of the country progresses, the more Trump is going to become the archetype of overreaching government authoritarian. And pretty much any US president fits into that category. And Trump has been able to harness a lot of power by leaning into that on purpose. However, the more of a reality that it becomes for people that Trump is sending in the tanks and military soldiers with guns are patrolling the streets, that is going to create a different impression of where America is at. And so if we can focus on keeping the narrative about that and not letting them make the predominant narrative that everything is safer because there's soldiers in the streets now, we have a chance at invoking a response to this military occupation that amounts in an overall rejection of the occupation of American cities. So that's the only hope that we have. And just remember that every moment counts, and every single action and thing that you say and moment that you take to resist what you see happening around you matters. It all adds up, and the more you do that and the more you encourage others to do that, the more we'll find a path forward.